Hello everyone, and happy 4th of July weekend. It's Elliot Yu here with the Free Market Speculator and the Energy Bulletin, and welcome to my Sunday Deep Dive. In this weekly video, we look at a key chart, trend, or indicator that caught my eye over the past week, and I explain what it means, or at least what I think it means, for financial markets. Now, this Independence Day weekend, more than 68 million Americans are under an active National Weather Service extreme heat warning or advisory. The heat wave has pushed daytime highs 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit above historical averages across the eastern two-thirds of the United States, sending places like Central Park in New York City into the triple digits for the first time in 14 years. Even worse than the daytime highs is the stifling evenings, something we do know about down here in Florida. One of the most dangerous metrics from the National Weather Service this weekend is the lack of overnight relief, with lows refusing to drop below the mid-70s or low 80s in many places. But as the mercury redlines, the real story isn't the ambient temperature, it's what's happening on the electrical grid. So let's start with this. Now, this is an X post, and that's what we used to call a tweet, right? From New York City's socialist mayor, Zohran Mamdani. If you spent any time on X this holiday weekend, or even just watched the news on TV, you probably saw the absolute firestorm surrounding this tweet, telling New Yorkers to turn up their air conditionings to 78 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 25 or 26 degrees Celsius for those of you who prefer to go metric. Instantly, the internet fractured into its usual camps. One side started screaming that this is what happens under a socialist mayor, while the other side yelled that a climate change demand explosion is breaking the system. Now, I'll address both of those specific political assertions here in just a moment. However, here's the problem. Both sides are completely missing the more important point and the real underlying structural problem. It's a sort of slow motion train wreck that's been building for many years. Now, what's happened in New York the past few days, it's not a surprise. And the hard truth is that it's only going to get worse. Today, we are going to dive into the raw math to show you how a policy engineered supply collapse turned a standard summer heat wave into an operational emergency. And if you think this is just a localized regulatory blunder isolated to New York State, think again. The policy mismatch we're looking at in New York this weekend is an early warning sign of a much bigger structural fracture. In fact, next week, I'm going to dive into a massive unfolding crisis, a solar Chernobyl moment. It's a regulatory meltdown, in this case, meeting the cold, hard realities of physics that's happening right now that threatens the entire global energy supply system. But to understand how the global grid is walking toward that knife's edge, we have to look first at the immediate blueprint playing out in New York through America's 250th birthday weekend. So let me back up for a second and outline the issue this weekend in New York specifically. You see, New York's Independent System Operator, or NYISO, NYISO for short, is the organization that manages New York State's electricity grid and wholesale power markets. And amid the three-day holiday weekend, NYISO is struggling to maintain grid stability under the immense load of air conditioning demand. Think about thousands of commercial chillers and millions of residential compressors kicking on to combat the afternoon heat domes. While NYISO has officially kept its public status at an energy watch rather than an outright emergency, behind the scenes, they've already pulled the emergency glass case levers, right? Officially activating their emergency demand response programs to aggressively force factories and commercial buildings off the grid. And of course, part of that emergency response is asking various government leaders, like Mayor Mamdani and New York Governor Kathy Hochul, to urge New York residents to conserve power to avoid overwhelming the grid, including turning up your AC thermostats to 78 degrees. Now take a look. This is a chart created using actual hourly data from NYISO over the past few days. Specifically, that blue line represents the load. Basically, that's the demand for electricity on the grid. and that's for New York's grid, every hour of the day from June 25th of this year at midnight through the end of the day on July 3rd, which was Friday. The orange line I've drawn shows NYISO's operational threshold. The operational threshold has two components. First, it's New York's total net capacity resources. Basically, that's all generating capacity in New York State, and contracted imports from other regions of the US, or really North America, like the PJM grid, which is in the Mid-Atlantic US, ISO New England, or Hydro-Quebec in Canada. Okay, so second, to calculate the operational threshold, we then subtract the operating reserves, right? Reserve from those net capacity resources. Now, the operating reserve is legally mandated by state and federal entities, specifically the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, and the New York State Reliability Council. And NYISO's job is to enforce it in real time. The core engineering idea here is pretty simple. Should a major power plant or transmission hub suddenly fail when demand is high, there must be enough spinning capacity elsewhere on the system, on the grid, to instantly bridge the gap. If that backup isn't there, grid frequency drops, which is 60 hertz in the US, triggering an automatic, catastrophic chain reaction that can result in a massive blackout and severe physical damage to the actual grid infrastructure itself, warped turbines, for example. Now look closely at my chart here, and you'll see that electricity demand in New York sees peaks and troughs over the course of a normal summer day, right? So peak demand is normally in the afternoons and early evenings, in that 6 or 7 p.m. region usually, with an overnight lull in demand around 4 a.m. or so, when it's usually cooler. Now, back in late June, peak demand was in that 21,000 to 24,000 megawatt region, providing a comfortable headroom to the operational threshold, which is at just under 32,000 megawatts right now. However, as the heat started to build into early July, so did power demand. On July 1st, peak demand reached 29,582 megawatts at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, leaving only around 2,400 megawatts left to get to that operational threshold. On July 2nd, peak load absolutely exploded to 31,097 megawatts at 7 p.m., leaving less than 900 megawatts of headroom to that operational threshold. And on July 3rd, that's Friday, the peak load remained dangerously elevated at over 30,000 megawatts at about 6 p.m. Now, fortunately for New York, the heat backed off on Saturday, July 4th, and the peak load dropped back down to around 28,250 megawatts. However, it's even worse than what I'm presenting you here with these numbers, right? The raw load numbers I'm presenting do not reflect the unconstrained demand for power in New York. This is just the actual metered load, what was actually provided. If NYISO calls for emergency public conservation appeals, such as what you saw from the governor and Mayor Mamdani, activates large-scale commercial demand response, which they did, which is basically paying factories to shut down, or if they utilize targeted voltage reductions, which is a fancy word for brownouts, the benefit of those actions is already, and I would put benefit in quotes here, right? It's already baked into those numbers. It means that the real unconstrained consumer demand during that July 2nd heat wave was actually higher than the 31,097 megawatts recorded on my chart. Now, while NYISO doesn't publish these emergency demand response megawatts that they saved in this baseline load data, they will publish, or likely anyway, details of this heat wave in an upcoming report, as they usually do. And initial reports are that the coincident peak load on Thursday, July 2nd, the peak of the heat wave, reached a whopping 32,410 megawatts, above the operational threshold. This is the absolute peak demand rather than the hourly average figures that I've displayed on my chart. And the fingerprints of these emergency demand measures are really already here. On July 2nd, if you look closely, you can see that the load on the grid suddenly flatlined around 31,000 megawatts all the way from 6 to 8 p.m. that day, instead of continuing to build as it might normally be expected to do around that time. And there are other signs of strain, including the U.S. Department of Energy issued emergency orders to PJM. Now that's the neighboring grid operator in the mid-Atlantic states. And what they did is they compelled data centers that have backup generation to pull themselves off the grid entirely to free up electricity exports, transmission space to New York. Now Con Edison was forced to initiate targeted preemptive power cuts. On Friday, they deliberately shut off electric service to nearly 10,000 customers in Southwest Queens, impacting areas like Howard Beach, to make emergency repairs and to prevent the local grid architecture from suffering more permanent, widespread failure. The localized blackouts have been heavily concentrated in specific boroughs, with thousands losing power across Staten Island, the Bronx, particularly Riverdale, and Queens, including both Richmond Hill and Flushing, New York. So that's what's been happening. Now, thankfully, the entire system didn't collapse. A lot of these blackouts were very localized, and given the size of New York City and New York State, not a whole lot of people, right? However, that was only because NYISO implemented emergency demand measures and quite likely caught a bit of good luck. However, the wider point is that it's not a surprise this happened, and sadly, it will likely happen again. Now, each spring, usually around April, NYISO issues a report showing its projections for peak summer demand for power relative to that operating threshold. In this year's report, titled, rather uncreatively, right, 2026 Power Trends, this was issued again, as I said, back in April. NYISO said, and I quote, "Reliability margins are tightening, and the system is becoming more sensitive to uncertainty. Across the state, long-standing generation resources are retiring or aging, while new supply is not being added at the pace or with the characteristics, more on that in a minute, necessary to fully replace them. As a result, the electric system is operating with narrower margins for error, increasing exposure to extreme weather, fuel constraints, and variability in both supply and demand." And here's the actual data on summer baseline operating capacity margins dating back to the summer of 2018 from that same NYISO report. As you can see, back in 2019, NYISO's operating capacity margins, meaning the difference between their estimates for maximum summer baseline loads and that operating threshold I spoke about earlier, was over 2,200 megawatts. By 2023, that operating capacity margin had fallen to under 1,400 megawatts. The margin fell to 752 megawatts in 2024, bounced a bit to 997 megawatts in 2025, and finally plummeted to a razor-thin 417 megawatts this summer in 2026. Tight capacity margins means higher risks of emergency measures, like we saw this weekend, and higher risks of brownouts and blackouts. NYISO also included this chart in their April report. This actually shows the number of NYISO demand response events, like the emergency measures they took this month amid the heat wave, by year, for the whole year, since 2010. As you can see, in 2025, there were 22 such emergency events, more than double the number in any prior year on my chart. And the capacity margins are tighter this year than they were in 2025. So back to the political responses I heard to Mamdani's tweet. Is New York's problem caused by climate change and hotter summers driving demand for air conditioning? This chart gives a very clear answer, no. As I said earlier, these operating capacity margins are a function of comparing net capacity requirements, demand for power, and the load on the grid to New York's available generating capacity, including that legally mandated operating reserve requirement. The peak summer demand baseline is the blue line on this chart, and the orange line shows the supply side of the equation. The difference between these two lines is the operating capacity margin. The bigger the gap of supply over demand, the more comfortable New York's summer margin of power supply over demand is. Hotter summer temperatures caused by climate change would theoretically show a demand side impact, effect. However, look at the blue line on this chart. Now that's summer seasonal peak demand estimated by NYISO. As you can see, it's been trending down since 2018. Indeed, from 2018 to 2026, NYISO slashed its estimate of total summer baseline demand by 1,325 megawatts. Demand for grid power on this basis has been flat since 2024, around the lowest levels of the entire past decade. Listen, I'm not going to sit here and tell you whether or not you should be concerned about climate change. Frankly, that's not my job. However, what I can tell you as a fact is that it's not the cause of New York's grid issues in recent years. If that were the case, then the shrinking operating reserve would be the result of surging demand. What we're seeing is exactly the opposite. The problem for New York is on the supply side. The 2,673 megawatt drop in net summer generating capacity between 2018 and this year, 2026 alone. Now on my chart here, I've labeled some major drivers of falling supply of power. One is that New York shut down the Indian Point nuclear power plant. Unit 2 of this facility was shut down on April 30th, 2020, and Unit 3 on April 30th, 2021. If you're wondering, Unit 1 was a small, early nuclear generating unit that went into service in the 60s, and it's been shut since the 70s, so not in the equation. Since NYISO calculates their summer capacity availability estimates based on units operating on May 1st, Unit 2 would have been removed from the net capacity resource estimates in 2020 and Unit 3 in 2021. In total, that's 2,040 megawatts of dependable, dispatchable baseload power. Carbon-free power, I might add, gone over the course of just 2 summers. The second issue is a New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, DEC rule that first passed in 2019. The DEC was targeting a local pollutant, nitrogen oxide, or NOx, emitted from so-called peaker plants. Basically, peaker plants are smaller power plants that can burn oil or natural gas in most cases. They're designed to fire up quickly, within sort of 10 to 15 minutes generally, and feed power into the grid when it's most desperately needed, such as during summer heat waves. They don't operate all the time, they just feed in for peak demand. Now these are older plants, and DEC found that when they do run, they emit some 30 times the nitrogen oxide NOx of modern plants. So DEC issued a ruling capping the amount of nitrogen oxide these plants can emit during so-called ozone season from May 1st to September 30th. These caps were designed to be enacted over time, and the core compliance deadlines under this law, again, it was passed in late 2019, but the main deadlines were between May 2023 and May 2025, over that 2-year period. Now, the regulation gave the owners of these plants a brutal ultimatum. The operators here either spend tens of millions of dollars retrofitting these tiny aging units with advanced emission scrubbing technology, replace them with utility scale batteries, very expensive, or shut them down forever. For the vast majority of operators, the economics just didn't make any sense. As a result, over 1,000 megawatts of downstate peaking capacity was deactivated or heavily restricted by May of 2023 rather. Hundreds of additional megawatts were forced off the grid ahead of the 2024 and 2025 summer seasons. In the end, NYISO formally determined that New York City would face catastrophic blackouts on a 95-degree day, not that uncommon there, if everything closed on schedule, if all these peaker plants closed down on schedule. To prevent a disaster, NYISO legally forced 4 massive barge-mounted peakers in Brooklyn, the Gowanus and Narrows units, to stay online past their planned retirement dates until at least May of 2027 or until new transmission lines are completed. However, that was, of course, only a partial and temporary patch. 1,000 megawatts of this downstate capacity online just a few years ago is gone for good, further eroding the state's already thin operating margin. And this brings me to another major related issue. NYISO has been careful to point out that what New York really needs is dispatchable capacity. This is generation capacity that can be brought online quickly when needed and sustained, like those peaker plants, or other fossil fuel facilities or nuclear plants. Now, under New York's current legal mandates, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the state is supposed to have a 100% zero-emission electricity sector by 2040. But in their recent grid health assessments and power trends reports, NYISO has explicitly stated that existing natural gas and dual fuel, these are plants that can burn either natural gas or oil, they can't be retired yet. In fact, they are warning that New York may need to approve new fast-starting natural gas plants or repower older ones as a bridge. The grid operator has repeatedly noted that as demand spikes from using electric vehicles and building electrification, fossil fuel units are the only commercially viable assets currently keeping the lights on during peak summer heat waves and increasingly winter freezes. Now look at this chart, also from NYISO's operating report. In 2025, last year, more than 10% of power produced from fossil fuels in New York State came from generation facilities more than 50 years old. Many of these plants are long past their assumed retirement age. Indeed, the state has one of the oldest generation fleets in the United States. This causes myriad issues. One is that as plants age, they become less reliable and more prone to breaking down, a fact which NYSE has to factor into its summer capacity availability estimates, as it increases risks during events such as heat waves. And of course, these older facilities, like the peaker plants I spoke about earlier, they're also dirtier from an emission standpoint, whether you're talking about nitrogen oxide, carbon dioxide as well, of course. These simply can't be replaced by intermittent renewable technologies like wind and solar. Now, here's how NYISO put it in their 2026 Power Trends report, and I quote, "As aging fossil fuel plants deactivate or experience performance declines, the system loses assets that provided dependable, multi-hour output and operational flexibility. New resources, primarily wind, solar, and shorter duration storage, offer benefits, but currently lack the full range of capabilities needed to sustain essential grid services during extended stress events. This creates a widening gap between what operators require and what the evolving fleet can deliver." Now, you can see that in the action, you can see it in the action on July 2nd, the peak of this week's heat wave. This chart shows the actual generation on NYISO, the whole operating area, through the day on July 2nd, and it gets broken down into 5-minute increments, so a lot of granularity here. As you can see, this lines up well with the chart I showed you earlier of those annual load estimates and the net capacity threshold. The maximum output was 28,576 megawatts at 7:25 p.m. on July 2nd. Now this is generation, so it doesn't include the power NYISO brought in from other regions like PJM under these long-term contracting deals. Now at that peak demand moment, when air conditioning demand was surging amid the afternoon heat dome we talked about earlier, here's the exact breakdown of NYISO's fuel sources. Fossil fuels carried a staggering 65.9%, almost 2/3 of New York's entire generation. And if I add in hydroelectric power and nuclear, that figure jumps to 94.13% of NYISO's generation at the peak of the heat wave. Intermittent renewables were almost entirely missing in action. For example, NYISO indicates that heading into the summer of this year, it had about 2,710 megawatts of wind capacity. Most of that's onshore, 2,578 onshore, and 132 megawatts offshore. And at 7:25 p.m., those wind turbines were operating at about 48% of capacity. feeding in just 1,327 megawatts to the grid. Now, believe it or not, that was actually pretty solid for that day. On average, on July 2nd, New York's wind turbines operated at only 41.3% capacity. And amid the stagnant era of a heat wave, the low for New York's wind generation on July 2nd was just 505 megawatts, a capacity factor of less than 19%. To comply with the 2040 zero-emission law, while keeping the grid from crashing, NYISO actually invented a new regulatory acronym, DEFRs, D-E-F-Rs, Dispatchable Emissions-Free Resources. NYISO explicitly states in its comprehensive reliability plans for the long-term planning that to replace fossil fuels, New York will need at least 20 to 32 gigawatts of these DEFRs by 2040. The catch? As NYISO openly admits in all its reports, DEFRs do not actually exist at a commercial scalable level today. Now, the list of potential DEFRs would include small modular nuclear reactors and batteries that can provide power for much longer than the 2 to 4 hour windows that current battery technologies offer. All told, NYISO said in its April report that, and I quote again, "The urgency of this moment cannot be overstated. Investment must occur now, not sometime in the future." So let's go back to Mamdani's tweet. Was this call to raise thermostats to 78 degrees unusual or unprecedented? No, not at all. This is standard operating procedure when the grid is in an emergency situation, just as I outlined. Elected officials in other states and cities have issued similar calls in the past, both Democrats and Republicans. And is Mamdani to blame for the current mess? Also, not really. As I just outlined, New York's issues have been building for years, long before most people had even heard of Mamdani. However, there is an important footnote that needs mentioning. As a state lawmaker, Zohran Mamdani consistently and actively campaigned to shut down the city's peaking gas plants. The irony, or dual fuel plants. The irony we're seeing play out over this July 4th weekend is that the exact environmental policy victories, and again, I put that in quotes, his movement fought for are what removed the state's dispatchable safety margin, and now, as mayor, he is the one who has to go out on the internet and tell millions of sweating New Yorkers to turn their thermostats to 78 degrees. Because the replacements, well, they're just not ready. NYISO's 2026 Power Trends report was published back in April, and it was uncharacteristically blunt. Emergency events such as we saw this weekend were likely to happen because of New York's aging generation fleet. The retirement of dispatchable generation capacity, like the Indian Point nuclear power facility, and the rise of weather-based intermittent technologies like solar and wind. Ironically, as wind and solar technologies share of total generation rises, the need for dispatchable power sources, fossil fuels for example, that can feed into the grid when average wind velocities slow or solar panels are covered with snow in winter, actually rises. You need more dispatchable power to offset that intermittency, not less. This chart shows data from the Energy Information Administration's April 2026 Electricity Monthly Update. Very recent, right? This is the average retail cost of electricity for all end-use sectors, residential customers, commercial buildings, and industrial facilities like factories. Now, it's measured in US cents per kilowatt hour. Now, as you can see, New York is at 22.87 cents per kilowatt hour, compared to the national average of 13.88 cents. Compared to April 2025, the average US retail rate rose by about 6%, but New York's average rate was up more than twice that, at a 14% increase. Also, please note that the entire Northeast region has elevated electricity costs. Maine at 23.76 cents per kilowatt hour, Rhode Island at 24.61 cents, Massachusetts at 25.28 cents, and Connecticut at a whopping 26.78 cents, a rate exceeded by only California and remote Hawaii. Meanwhile, much like NYISO, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC, has flagged a structural mismatch between policy goals and operational realities for ISO New England, which is their grid manager. Both regions are actively retiring older dispatchable fossil fuel baseload plants before new resources are available to replace them. In short, higher than average costs and lower than average reliability. As I said, right now at the beginning of this video, other countries and regions of the world are experiencing some of the same issues. In April 2025, a major blackout impacted Spain, Portugal, and parts of France, caused to a significant degree by heavy reliance on intermittent renewable sources and insufficient dispatchable fossil fuel generation available to offset it. Sound familiar? And just last week, the Energy Institute released its annual statistical review of world energy, a vast treasure trove of data on the global energy system I look forward to each year. Now, I'm going to analyze it in more depth, as I said, in next week's episode of the Sunday Deep Dive. However, let me tell you this. In 2025, the big three fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, and coal, they accounted for a commanding 86.24% of global primary energy supply, compared to solar at 1.69%. However, solar showed tremendous growth. In fact, as you can see here, I'll throw this slide up on your screen. If we look solely at the change in energy supply in 2025 compared to 2024, solar was the fastest growing source of energy in the world. It accounted for 28.5% of all energy demand growth and supply growth last year. And the total for solar was 2.32 exajoules of additional primary energy from solar in 2025 versus 2024, right? Now, China was responsible for 1.2 exajoules of that, more than half the global total. A lot of people pointed to that and saw it as affirming solar's tremendous potential to replace fossil fuels in the global energy mix. However, dig just a bit deeper and the picture changes entirely in a dramatic fashion. Starting a year ago in February of 2025, a little over a year ago, China made significant changes to the way the government subsidizes and encourages the growth of solar power. The result has been a collapse in new solar generation built in China this year. The problem for China, well, it rhymes with what we're seeing in New York and Europe. It's a major speed bump and a bottleneck for solar and other intermittent sources like wind. And new details of China's 15th five-year plan released by the Communist Party there just days ago at the end of June confirm this shift. We'll cover that topic at more depth, tracking some of the key trends and statistics I'm watching in next weekend's Sunday Deep Dive. So that's it for this week. If you enjoyed this week's video, please drop me a like or a comment, and you can subscribe for free to make sure that you receive this weekly video and my other posts and updates when they're released, like next Sunday's deep dive, which I think you'll find very interesting. If you'd like to give the paid tier of Free Market Speculator, including our popular Energy Bulletin Top 10 model portfolio, if you want to give that a try, I'm still offering for a very limited time 30-day free trials via the link below this video. Thanks again for listening, and please stay cool out there. I'll see you next week for another episode of my Sunday Deep Dive.